Hi there. In this video, I'll be going over the correct answers to the fourth passage from the 2008 released AP English Language and Composition multiple choice exam that discusses love and women. I'll also explain why the correct answers are correct, and in some cases I will underline why certain incorrect answers are incorrect. So let's go ahead and start. This first question, number 40. The passage as a whole is best described as which of these things? Well, the correct answer is B, criticism of the limited goals of women's education. And the key line that really helps you to see that is actually over here, right around line, where is it here? Line 15 through 19, roughly. The author writes, she writes, but Rousseau and most of the male writers who have followed these steps have warmly indicated the whole tendency of female education ought to be directed to one point to render them pleasing. And then the next line, let me reason with the supporters of this opinion. And so she sort of establishes her ethos and like indicates some boundaries of her argument, and then she mentions what the exigence is of her argument, this perspective, and the entire rest of the passage is focused on her criticism of the limited goals of women's education as outlined by Rousseau and others who have similar perspectives. Alrighty, number 41. In line 9, scepter, or scepter for some people, is used as one of these things. So let's read the line. The whole sentence here. To endeavor to reason love out of the world would be to out Quixote Cervantes, and equally offend against common sense, but an endeavor to restrain this tumultuous passion and to prove that it should not be allowed to dethrone superior powers or to usurp the scepter which the understanding should ever coolly wield appears less wild. Okay, so scepter, it uses the verb wield is here, so you know it's supposed to be some kind of weapon. But I don't really see that much reference to being a queen, so A can't be right. There's like maybe superior, maybe dethrone sort of vaguely implies being a queen, but I think that's definitely not the strongest answer here. A synonym for the word sword, well, or to usurp the sword which the understanding should ever coolly wield appears less wild. No, that doesn't really work. Let's see. Metaphor for love, no. Like the scepter. Why would a scepter, a big weapon, like a sort of like a lance? It's sort of something like what a like a grim reaper might hold, right? A scythe, right? It's similar to that. It would be that. Why would that be a metaphor for love? That doesn't really make sense. So we're going to go for the correct answer here, according to the College Board, is D, symbol of authority. Right? This is intended to be a symbol of authority. 42. The first paragraph, lines 1 to 11, functions as a reasoned introduction to an argument. That is A, right? Again, 1 to 11, we're really like, ultimately we have this author trying to say like, this is what I'm, just to do this thing and just try to say this thing would not be okay, but I can make an argument that has this limitation, right? The limitation in particular that love should be restrained by understanding, by the mind, by superior powers of intelligence and reason, right? That's the sort of the limitation of her argument, and so that she establishes. So A is correct. She doesn't. Her thesis is her. If she had a thesis, it would probably be that Rousseau's perspective on women's education is not valid, but this isn't really evidence for that. It's just sort of some background or some again establishing the boundaries of her own argument. There's no story. Narrative is the rhetorical motive, or the rhetorical motive narrative involves telling a story, and there's not really a story with a beginning, middle, and end, character, thematic message, all of that here. basic historical background material. It is background, but it's not historical background. So that's not going to work. Analysis of the boundaries of the case. Okay, again, like there is the boundaries of our argument, but it's not one case, and we're not like breaking down a specific case and talking about how its parts work together, which is what analysis is. So is not going to work either. 43. In line 14, the phrase "the most important years of life" is best taken to mean the years when what? Well, let's look over there. Line 14. Youth is the season for love in both sexes, but in those days of thoughtless enjoyment, provision should be made for the more important years of life, when reflection takes the place of sensation. So if youth includes sensation, what includes reflection? Well, that's going to be older, like when one is older, when one has reached maturity. So D is the correct answer in this case. 44. In lines 20 to 21, the author reveals her intention to do something. What does she do in 20 to 21? Let me reason with supporters of this opinion, though that is this opinion referring back to Rousseau, who have any knowledge of human nature. Do they imagine that marriage can eradicate the habitude of life? Okay, so she intends to, does she just intend to argue with those who question Rousseau's theories? Not really, because she says, let me reason with the supporters of this opinion who have any knowledge of human nature. And that word reason actually makes A a slightly better answer than B. So A is correct here. She doesn't acknowledge that young women may resist her ideas until later, where she says something like, I now speak of women who are restrained by principle or prejudice. She doesn't assume that her audience has little knowledge of human nature. She says the supporters of this opinion, referring back to Rousseau, and suggests that her audience has no personal experience of love. No, not really. Again, she's not really talking to her audience here. She's addressing the supporters of Rousseau's opinion. So again, we are looking at A as the correct answer. 45. The author's approach to reasoning with the supporters of this opinion, line 20, is to pose questions that which of these things? So let's look at these questions. First one, do they imagine, these people who agree with Rousseau, do they imagine that marriage can eradicate the habitude of life? The woman who's only been taught to please will soon find that her charms are oblique sunbeams. They can't have much effect on her husband's heart. Will she then have sufficient energy to look into herself and comfort and cultivate her mental faculties? Or is it not more rational that she might do this thing, right? Okay, we have a bunch of questions followed by responses to them, right? So what she's actually doing is answering her own questions or responding to her own questions from her own point of view, which is E. Her responses are not illogical. D is out. She provides answers to her questions. She responds to them, so she doesn't fear they can't be answered by anyone. She answers them. Answers with emotion rather than reason. I think her arguments are particularly logical, right? And then knows supporters have considered. Well, if she knew supporters had considered them, she likely would not have presented them as part of her logical argument. And she says here, like, do they imagine that this thing, right? And so there's some evidence here in her word choice and in her tone that she imagines the supporters of Rousseau's perspective, in fact, have not considered the questions that she's asking in their respective answers. Okay, up here, 46. In line 24, the sunbeams are oblique because they are, which of these things? This was sort of a challenging question. Are the sunbeams beautiful and fleeting? Well, let's look at the context here. A woman who has only been taught to please will soon find, after time passes, that her charms are oblique sunbeams and that they cannot have much effect on her husband's heart when they are seen every day and when the summer is past and gone. The summer is intended to really mean her beauty, right? The beauty of the woman in question. This is actually an allusion to a Shakespeare sonnet, which is really buried here, and I think you don't really need to get that illusion in order to understand what's going on here, but the sonnet begins, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate, right? So you could look that up if you want, but that's really what's being referenced here. So, but very beautiful and very fleeting, maybe not really, because they aren't going to have much effect on her husband's heart. If they were very beautiful, they would probably have more of an effect on her husband's heart. Okay, overly familiar and growing weaker, maybe. Shyly revealing, subtly ingratiating. Are they shyly revealing? Maybe, well, if they're not really having much of an effect, then are they revealing some information to him effectively? Maybe I'm leaning toward no. Subtly ingratiating. Again, if he's not really enjoying them or getting much out of them or he's not being affected by them, then maybe not. Meaningless to the person casting them. To the person receiving them, maybe yes, but to the person casting them, no. Distorted by the person at whom they are directed. Well, they're not reflected off in this question. This is distorted, not reflected by. And is the person isn't necessarily wouldn't make them oblique, which just means approaching approaching not straight on but at an angle. And so I think going through all these answers, the one that really floats to the surface is the best is going to be B, overly familiar and growing weaker. The passage clearly says, right, they can't have much effect on her husband's heart when they're seen every day, when summer has passed and gone. So, right, they're overly familiar to him and maybe also growing weaker because time has passed. All right. Okay, 47, which of the following is closest in meaning to the word prejudice as it is used in line 40? Well, let's look at line 40. I now speak of women who are restrained by principle or prejudice. Who are restrained in doing what? Right? Okay, restrained in an action as mentioned before, right? When the husband ceases to be a lever and the time will inevitably come, her desire of pleasing will then grow languid or become spring of bitterness. Where is it? It's actually earlier. Where is it here? Or is it not more rational to expect that she will try to please other men, so be unfaithful to her husband, and in the emotions raised by the experience of new male conquests, endeavor to forget the mortification her love or pride has received from her husband? Well, okay, so would it make sense then women who are restrained by principle or unfounded dislike? No, maybe that doesn't really make sense. A loss of faith, principle or a loss of faith? Why would someone be restrained from cheating on their husband by a loss of faith? I think gaining of faith or reinforcement of faith, when we're talking about Christian faith or faith in someone, might restrain someone, but not loss of faith. Let's see. Innovative thinking, principle or innovative thinking. Innovative thinking might, I don't know, in this context, might encourage, breaking societal rules in order to find love. Fixed convictions. So principle, like one does not commit adultery, or prejudice, one just believes it's wrong. They have a fixed conviction that it's wrong. D is the correct answer here. Affectionate approval, principle, affectionate approval. Affectionate approval of what? If one has affectionate approval of seeking new conquests, then I think they would not be restrained. All right, so clearly D is the correct answer. 48, lines 39 to 47. I now speak discontent. Okay, let's look here. What is the purpose of this section? Speaking of women who wouldn't actually cheat on their husbands, who would shriek from an intrigue or a tryst, a moment of infidelity with abhorrence. they might have some consequences, right? Weeks and weeks are spent dreaming of the happiness enjoyed by congenial souls till their health is undermined, their spirits broken by discontent. Right, so this is the result when one, no longer is receiving love, even when they are a little older, and maybe are not, according to this author, like summer has passed and gone, and maybe aren't, having their charms received in the same way. So this sort of is actually a development of this initial idea that her desire of pleasing will then grow, become a spring of bitterness. And so E here is the correct answer, line 36. Right, is she trying to argue that women should behave like men behave? Well, no, there's not really any evidence of that at all. In fact, we don't have much description of how men behave much other than the natural biological tendency for, for physical attraction to fade over time. That's well documented in the modern day by science. And then let's see here. Illustrate the futility of looking into herself for comfort. No, that doesn't really make sense. Let's look at 28, 29 quickly here and try to figure out why that doesn't make sense. Will she have enough energy to look into comfort once, if she's already saddened by the fact that she's no longer getting love from her husband, right? Maybe it's true that she wouldn't be able to do that, but it's not necessarily true that doing so would be futile if she tried, or if she were able to do so successfully. So B is not going to work. And explore the dilemma of how principle can coexist with prejudice. Well, here, if prejudice means fixed convictions, then principle and prejudice are sort of cousins, preventing a woman from engaging in adultery. So, no. And then exemplify how efforts to please inevitably displease. I don't think this is really, there aren't really examples here of a person trying to put an effort in to please their husbands. And so that's not really the right answer either. I think the best one here is definitely E, developing a metaphor of the spring of bitterness. All right, 49. In context, the author's regard for the great art of pleasing is best described as what? Well, line 47, the great art of pleasing is actually sort of a reference back to Rousseau's idea that the main education of women should be to render them pleasing. And her regard or her perspective on that idea is minimal, right? She has very minimal regard, positive perspective, or she has very little, a very minimal positive perspective for toward that idea. So A is correct. 50. In line 55, a being is best taken to mean a woman's what? Well, okay. You have to, I think reading this out loud, or like, of course you couldn't do that on the exam, but like reading it out loud in your head, and not to rely for all her happiness on a being subject to like infirmities with herself. Relying for all her happiness on a being, on a person subject to like infirmities, right? This idea of relying for her happiness on another being, that of course being her husband, would be the result if a woman's education was just about being pleasing to one's husband, right? So that makes D the correct answer here, right? 51. The passage overall can best be classified as which of the following? A fictional narrative? Nope, we're not in the rhetorical mode of narrative. There's it's not a beginning, middle, end to theme model. A reasoned appeal? A reasoned, right? An appeal is like trying to get someone, is another word for an attempt to convince someone of something. B here is actually the correct answer. So this is in fact a reasoned appeal. She's using logic and reasoning to try to convince her readers that this idea of how women should be educated to render them pleasing only is bunk. All right, so a dispassionate analysis, no thing. Nothing is being broken down here, and she is actually quite passionate about her perspective. Formal petition. A formal petition would probably be addressed to somebody. There might be a lot more unctuousness involved. Dramatic accusation. Who is she accusing? You might argue she's accusing Rousseau, but in line 20, she says, "Let me reason with the supporters of this opinion." And so it's not just accusing him, but it's also she's talking about the perspective and not the person. So E is not a great answer. Definitely going to be B, a reasoned appeal. 52. The author appears to believe most firmly that passion and reason should be exercised equally. I mean, she does believe that reason is important, but she says here, like, right, an endeavor to restrain this tumultuous passion that is love, to prove that it should not be allowed to dethrone superior powers or usurp the scepter which the understanding should ever fully wield, right? Understanding being superior powers, being intelligence, right, indicates that she thinks that one should temper one's heart with one's mind, so they shouldn't be equal. Reason should be predominant. All right. Love is the highest level of fulfillment. No, she says here, the chaste wife and serious mother should only consider her power to please as the polish of her virtues, right? So everything else is more important than her power to please, which is sort of standing in for love in that sentence down there. All right. All passions, but especially love, must be subject to reason. Yes, 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 that is a correct answer. Hashtag yes. Okay. Right, everything must be subject to reason. She comes back to this idea of reason and the most important and putting reason before and reasoned development of oneself, like the chaste wife and serious mother should only consider her power plays as the polish of her virtues, and that she should instead be, by extension, developing other aspects of herself. That's all tied to the idea of reason, right? So that is definitely the correct answer. Women should delay marriage. The passions have cooled. She's not arguing women should delay marriage. She doesn't say anything about delaying marriage. People can get married young. They just need to temper their passions. Young men should seek wives who have been educated by women. I should say anything about education by women. She doesn't say anything. She's not counseling young men necessarily. She's addressing the followers of Rousseau's perspectives. 53. The author's reflections on married love are best described as which of these things? The best answer here is C, serious and cautionary, right? She illogical, contradictory. Well, no, she actually has some logical arguments. Her perspectives do not contradict each other. Romantic, optimistic. She tends to take all the romance and optimism and brush it under the rug in favor of reason and logic and tempered passion. Serious and cautionary. This is best, right? Tempered passion, put reason before emotion, right? Be cautious. Be careful what virtues you develop. Don't just develop oneself in order to please men. That's what she says to women. Glamorous and inflated. No, like I wouldn't say she thinks married love is glamorous, or in fact, she pretty clearly says it just goes away. Inflated, no. She, again, dismissive, I think, of all the emotional stuff in long term in marriage. And then speculative and shallow. No, she's pretty. She has. It's not speculative because she has plenty of evidence to support her claims. Not shallow because it's deeply reasoned. It's the opposite of shallow. Okay, 54. Throughout the passage, the author's argument is meant chiefly to inspire young men and women to be faithful to each other. She mentions being faithful, but I think she just says like that will be the unfaithfulness is a natural consequence of uh, women being trained only to please men and not to develop themselves. But she's not really trying to inspire young men to be faithful to each other. Questioning sincerity and expressions of love. I don't think she doesn't talk about specific expressions of love so much as love in general and its tendency to fade over time, and it's the fact that it's a tumultuous passion. All right. She bring to light the hardships of married women. I mean, she does do that, but she I she only does that at certain points here, like maybe when she mentions the spring of bitterness, and then again toward the end of the passage. But overall, considered as a whole, the author's argument and the woman who wrote this paper wasn't really trying to focus on bringing to light the hardships of married women. She could have done that in a lot of different ways. She didn't do that here. Describe the ideal education for women. She poses a problem that a problematic education for women, but she doesn't describe the ideal education for women. So the best answer here is actually to change perceptions of how women should relate to men. Right? Women shouldn't just be trying to please men, but should be trying to develop themselves, and love and her power to please should only be considered polish, making the rest of her as a person more beautiful. All right, that's the end of the questions, end of file.